Welcome back, everyone. As you can see from our timeline, we are still in Mesopotamia. We're moving right along, and today we are going to discuss the Assyrians. And if you remember from the last lecture, we discussed the Sumerians and the Akkadians. And there are some relations art historically, but this is a different group of people that have taken over this area. So last time we had city-states fighting against each other, and the art we looked at was based on sort of relations either with the gods or being a god themselves. If you think about those prayer statues we looked at and how they were meant to constantly pray, that was to make sure that the god was looking after them. Or if you think about Naram Sin and his horned helmet and how he saw himself as a divine ruler. So we'll see those kinds of relationships again, and we will also see relief sculpture and iconography, or the way things look, that are similar, but there are different things as well. So today we're going to look at lamasus, which are very important. We will look at more relief sculpture. We'll talk about Sargon II, who is not at all related to Sargon I, who we saw in the last one, even though he'll have that beard and headdress that looks similar. And we will look at the Ishtar Gate, which is this giant thing that's been rebuilt in Berlin. We might talk a little bit about what are the implications of taking art from a place and then reconstructing it in a European city. Or I might make you all talk about that in your discussion question. The Assyrians established their empire in the north of Mesopotamia and then swept south. Throughout their dominance, the Babylonians often rebelled against the rule of the Assyrians. The Assyrians would respond by bribing or threatening Babylon in order to retain control over the region. Assyria had several different capitals built by a succession of kings, and a common feature of these palaces were decorations that emphasized the king's power, might, and merciless dominance of enemies, as well as, of course, the gods and the spirits that protected the king. So the timeline sort of for the Assyrians is that they rose up in the north around 1400 BCE. They pushed south from northern Mesopotamia. In 1000 BCE, they conquered the neighboring areas. Around 900, the Assyrian kings sent out their armies to conquer new lands. And they went further east and west, and then this became all part of the Assyrian Empire. So by 800 BCE, they controlled most of Mesopotamia. At 600 BCE, the empire was at their highest point, and they extended as far southwest as Egypt. So they went basically into northern Africa. They conquered foreign cities. They brought wealth back. The conquered had to pay tribute to the king every year. And if you rebelled against the king's rule or refused to give tribute, then, of course, the king would lead the army against the country. The empire finally collapsed around 600 BCE due to mismanagement of such a large amount of space and the creation of abundant enemies. The Assyrians' art and architecture adapted traditions and conventions from southern Mesopotamia that we've already looked at. And the most notable works are reliefs that depicted hunting scenes. We will look at those in detail today. We'll start with Assur-Nasirpal II, and he established his capital at Kalu, which is present-day Nimrud in Iraq, on the bank of the Tigris River. He made a walled city with walls 5 miles long and 42 feet high and 120 feet thick. So he was serious about protecting the city. Most big buildings were made of mud brick, which we have seen already in the ziggurats, and they also used limestone and alabaster veneers. Basically, they put thin stones around the mud brick, and this looked better, and also limestone and alabaster could be carved. This image that you're looking at is a recreation of the throne room. And one thing I want you to know, in most of these cultures that we look at, even though all of the statues are free of paint, most everything was painted. This goes for the Egyptians, it goes for the Greeks, and they would carve a scene on a wall and then they would paint the scene. So it has a three-dimensional aspect, but it also is really bright and colorful. All right, so upon entering these palaces, they would often put these giant human-headed winged bulls. They are known as lamassus. And they were carved from single blocks of stone, so the artist had to be able to duplicate and mirror the same thing on either side. They were gateway pieces, but the rest of the palace was filled with reliefs of hunting scenes and royal power. So these are different from what else you would see inside the palace. If you look at the faces, you might think that it looks like they're smiling a little bit, and there's a reason for that. Even though they're supposed to be intimidating, they also seem a little joyous. So when you pass by them and you walk into the city, they not only are supposed to say, those who enter beware, but also they watch your back and give you a sense of solidarity. So that might be the double meaning there, that they're your protectors, but they also are protecting from those that don't belong. We see these as statues, but they actually believed that they were real figures of protection. So I'm going to give you a couple facts, but I'm also going to ask you a few questions in the lecture questions about these. They have those horn caps, and we have seen helmets with horns before. So one of the questions is where and what do you think it means? They have these belts that kind of wrap around them. Those belts signify power, like to harness the power of these bulls. They have 5 legs. Another question for you when you get to the lecture questions. Why do you think they have 5 legs? Lamassus weren't just built as gatekeepers. They would also be engraved in clay tablets, and then the everyday people would take these clay tablets and they would bury the clay tablets under the threshold of their doors to act as guardians for their homes. As far as city protectors, lamassus would be placed at the cardinal points of a walled city. So north, south, east, and west. There would be a pair of lamassus in whichever direction you came into the city to help protect the inhabitants of that city. So you had them at the gates of the walls, and then you had each person would bury lamassu clay tablets underneath their doors. They really were seen as supernatural protectors of the inhabitants of a city. This is a wall scene from a later successor, Assurbanipal, and it's in Nineveh. And it was a palace complex that had beautiful relief carvings on all the walls, and a very popular subject for Assyrian kings was the lion hunt. So the king is often depicted as part of the action, and the action is presented as occurring continuously. There's a video that I'll have you watch about this thing specifically. The funny thing is that the action was most likely staged. The animals would be released in an enclosed area. The king was protected by warriors. I like to think of it as an Instagram account where people's lives look much more interesting, but then if you pan out, you see like, oh, that guy's just standing next to a TV. So there's a smart history video that I'll have you watch, and it basically shows how this is kind of a narrative. It's a scene that plays out over the space of a wall. Another question that you will have with this lecture is a comparison between these two relief sculptures. So one, you have Assurbanipal, and it is a relief sculpture on a wall, and then you have that victory stele of Naram-Sin that we looked at in the last lecture. And there are a few things that I want you to consider when you do this comparison. First of all, I want you to think about time. Like in the Assurbanipal sculpture, is this a specific moment in time, or is it a vague, this just happened at one point? And the same question is about Naram-Sin. What is the point of this story that we're looking at? Is this we crush our enemies, or we are stealthy? What about the size of the figures and the overlapping elements? And what does that have to do with spatial positioning, or what we talked about last time, hieratic scale? And then consider the anatomy of these different figures in each sculpture. Is it more accurate, less accurate? Think about the details that you can see in the Assurbanipal as opposed to the Naram-Sin. Like, look at the water, look at the trees, look at the rocks. And who's winning and who's losing, and how do you know in either of these things? So those are questions I want you to consider when you compare these two works of art. Okay, moving on, we are going to talk a little bit about Sargon II, who, like I said before, is not related to the earlier Sargon from the last lecture. And Sargon II suppressed rebellions, he conquered the kingdom of Israel, and in 710 BCE he conquered the kingdom of Babylon, thus reuniting Assyria with its southern rival Babylonia, and it had been separated since the death of Hammurabi, whose famous law code we looked at last time, since 1750 BCE. Sargon II built his new Assyrian capital at Dur-Sharrukin, and it's dominated by a walled citadel for a palace. And it was similar to Assur-Nasr-Pal's complex that we talked about earlier with the giant thick walls. And I think it's safe to assume that something like this is very powerful. And when you come upon it, you are struck by its immensity and its power. But I also think that underneath, like if you were to do a psychological evaluation, these things could also mean they're afraid and they're a little weak. Because later, when we look at the Persian complexes, there's no walls around them. So what does it mean to build walls? You know, it means that you're afraid you're going to be invaded. If you have no walls, then you feel like you're strong enough that you don't need them. Be that as it may, Sargon built giant walls for his citadel. And you can see that when you enter the southeast gateway and all gateways that would have gone into the city, you are greeted by lamassus. And the towers there are really interesting because they have these crenellated rooftops. And if anybody's ever seen a medieval castle, you have seen crenellated rooftops. And basically it's a place for archers to shoot their arrows down from and have protection. And the reason that we see crenellated towers in the 6th century BCE in Mesopotamia and then later in medieval castles is because the Crusaders who went to the east to restore Christianity, I guess, saw these designs and they thought, this is brilliant, we're going to take them back to our own lands. Eventually, the Assyrian Empire falls, and there is the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And Babylonian kings re-established their power in the south. Nebuchadnezzar II is the most famous king of Neo-Babylon, and today he's famous, if you read the Bible, because of the persecution of the Jews, or because that's the name of the ship in the Matrix. Babylon is known as one of the greatest cities of antiquity, and it brought in this new era of architectural activity. There was a complete reconstruction of the imperial grounds. There was a brand new giant ziggurat that was built. It's known as the Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, and it's possibly the same Tower of Babel that is also mentioned in the Old Testament. One very impressive structure from the city of Babylon is the Ishtar Gate. And this was a city gate that was faced with blue glazed bricks that were molded into reliefs of animals or other decorative items. And it was one of the 8 gates that ringed the perimeter of Babylon. A reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate can be found in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, because in the early 20th century, German archaeologists dismantled the Ishtar Gate and packed it up to take them with them to Berlin. It was then reconstructed in this museum. It's 50 feet high, and the original foundations extended another 45 feet underground. So eventually we will have this conversation about what does it mean for all of these European museums to have all of these artifacts from places basically where they colonized or they just went in and took things. We'll see this again and again. A lot of the artifacts that we'll see, a lot of the artworks are in the British Museum, they're in the Louvre. The lamassus I already showed you were in the Louvre. So this is a topic that we will discuss in further detail, just not now. There is a name for the way that these blue bricks were made, and it's called faience. And basically the glaze in the bricks was a film of colored glass that adhered to the surface after firing. Basically it's a finely powdered quartz grain that's fused together with small amounts of alkali and or lime through partial heating. And it's usually colorless, but then natural impurities give them a brown or grayish tint. And then colorants can be added to give an artificial color. For example, copper taken from the north, with present-day Armenia. So on this gate, the mosaic work is brightly colored, and it had many animals, in addition to flowers or just abstract designs. And they were real and imaginary animals. There were aurochs, or giant bulls, and the aurochs represented the god Adad, who was the storm god. There were dragons, and they represented Marduk, who was the god of the ziggurat and the principal god of Babylon. And Marduk has a serpent head with front lion paws and eagle talons on the back, and then a stinger on his tail. And then the lions represent the god Ishtar, also known as Inanna, whom we've met before when we looked at Mesopotamia. And then animals represent the city, but like the Lamassus, they also provide and protect the city. So we're at the end here, but I want to end with this last kind of question for you, which is, in this relief sculpture that has these geometric designs, but also this procession of lions, you can see that even though lions are fierce, they also seem to be orderly and in control. And what is the benefit of showing these fierce creatures in this manner? What does it say about the power of the ruler? Why use these animals as protection, but also show them in this way? That'll be another question for you this week.